This story begins a few months ago. I've been driving for Lyft for several years now, and I usually stick to late night shifts. The roads are quieter and the tips are better. But there's a trade-off. Every once in a while, you get a story that sticks with you, and not in a good way. I've always considered myself careful. I've dealt with my fair share of odd passengers, but nothing, and I mean nothing, even came close to being as strange as what I'm about to tell you. I didn't have a dash cam at the time, and that night was the main reason I installed one. It started off normal enough. Just me and the occasional odd sounds my car would make. I drive a beat-up 2005 Volvo, but it's reliable as hell. The streets were deserted, which, as I mentioned earlier, I prefer. Sometime after 2 a.m., I got a ride request from a convenience store nearby. It seemed harmless at first, but for some reason, I got this weird feeling in my gut. You know that feeling when something's off, but you can't explain why? That's exactly what hit me as I drove up. Before I even saw the guy, I figured out why I was getting that gut feeling. The convenience store I was pulling up to was closed. All the lights were off, and there wasn't a single car in the lot. As I got closer, I saw him. I drove slowly to get a good look. He was pacing outside the store, wearing a ratty hoodie that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. I'm not exaggerating. There was literally a hole in the sleeve. His movements were jerky, like he couldn't stand still, and he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if he thought someone was after him. If I had to guess, he was on something. I probably should have canceled the ride and driven away. I even hovered my finger over the cancel button, but for some reason, I didn't. I unlocked the doors and he slid into the back seat without a word. I regretted my decision the moment I took my foot off the brake. Most passengers either scroll on their phones or stare out the window, but not him. He just sat there staring at me through the rearview mirror, not blinking, not looking away, just staring directly at me. I tried not to stare back, but I couldn't help catching his eye a couple of times. He looked angry, which was unsettling. I tried to ignore him and turned on the radio to break the silence. I don't even remember which station I clicked on, but the moment the music started playing, he snapped at me to turn it off. His voice was deep and raspy, and I could tell he was a smoker. That caught me off guard, and I jerked the steering wheel a little. I resisted the urge to look at him in the mirror and just did as he said, gripping the wheel tighter. I didn't say anything, and we drove in silence for a while. I thought maybe he'd just sit there quietly until we got to a stop. That's what I was hoping for, at least. But then he spoke. I remember the conversation like it was yesterday. He asked me if I ever picked up someone I shouldn't have. That question hit me like a brick. I let out an awkward laugh and said, "Well, I hope not," trying to keep it light. But he didn't react. He just leaned back and muttered something to himself that I couldn't hear. Then he started going on about how he used to be an Uber driver and quit because some punk stole stuff from his car. He was slurring his words so I couldn't make out everything, but I got the gist of it. I looked in the mirror once or twice while he was talking and realized he was smiling the whole time, which was incredibly unsettling. A normal person wouldn't smile while talking about something like that. He concluded his story by saying, "It's funny how much trust you put in someone sitting right behind you." That comment was what did it for me. I started thinking of him as more of a threat than just a crazy drug addict. Unfortunately, there wasn't much I could do about it. I felt my pulse speed up. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind was spinning. I glanced at the GPS, focusing on the destination like it was some kind of lifeline. But the guy didn't know when to stop talking. He kept babbling about nonsense. Some of it concerning, some of it just gibberish. I honestly couldn't keep up. Eventually, he started apologizing to someone, although I don't think it was me. He began insinuating that he had done something awful and that he was a bad person. He kept saying, "I didn't mean it," repeatedly, followed by a few frantic apologies. I didn't respond, worried that he'd do something if I did. I didn't know what he'd done or what he was capable of, but I wasn't about to find out. We were only a few minutes from his stop when he snapped out of his muttering haze and yelled at me that I had missed the turn. I didn't miss it. The GPS clearly showed we were on track, but I slammed on the brakes anyway, mostly out of fear. He demanded that I pull over, so that's what I did. My hands were shaking at that point. I just wanted the nightmare to be over. As soon as I shifted into park, headlights appeared behind us. It was a police car. I said a silent prayer and watched as it crept down the road, its spotlight briefly sweeping over my car. The guy in my back seat slouched down, trying to stay out of sight. I turned my head and saw him lying almost flat on the back seat with his eyes closed. I whipped my head back around before he saw me, trying to keep my breathing steady. He stayed in that position for an uncomfortably long time. I wanted to ask him to leave, but decided against it. Eventually, he lifted his head and told me I'd gotten lucky. Before I could do anything, he opened the car door and disappeared. I ended up calling my shift short after that. I was shaken up and didn't feel like driving anymore. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I came across something on my phone that proved how dangerous the situation had been. According to a news article, a convenience store had been robbed on the night I picked up that passenger. It was 2 blocks from where I had picked him up. It makes me sick knowing I was inches away from a dangerous criminal who could have harmed me if he had chosen to. I'm a little scared to contact the police about this. I try to avoid law enforcement for personal reasons I won't get into. I'm not sure if my report would even help. Either way, I'm much more cautious about who I let in my car now. I used to live in the city. The urban lifestyle was what I always envisioned for myself. But after an extremely traumatic experience, I couldn't bear even the smallest noises. I began to hate noise in general. My psychiatrist told me I had developed a rare case of phonophobia. That pins and needles feeling you get when your foot falls asleep? It's kind of like that, but in my chest, always there, like my body was bracing for something that wasn't coming. Every car horn or slamming door felt like a jolt straight to my nerves. I couldn't keep living like that. About 3 years ago, I found a cabin deep in the Pacific Northwest. I don't want to say exactly where it was for reasons you'll soon understand, but it was somewhere in Oregon. It seemed perfect. Very few neighbors, no traffic, barely any cell service. What really sold me on it, though, was the lack of noise. It was just me and the peace and quiet. For the first time in months, I thought I might actually feel safe. The cabin itself was small but cozy. It had been built to last, with thick wooden beams and a sturdy stone fireplace. It smelled like pine and old books when I first walked in. That earthy scent that's almost comforting. The nearest neighbor lived about a 10-minute walk down a narrow dirt path. I didn't meet her right away, though. For the first few days, I just soaked in the silence. I'd wake up to the sound of birds instead of sirens, and at night, the only thing I heard was the wind brushing through the trees. It was like the whole world had pressed pause, and I could finally breathe again. About a week after I moved in, there was a knock at the door. I opened it, expecting it to be my neighbor, and it was. She was a moderately old woman carrying a basket of preserves, like she had just stepped out of a Hallmark movie. She introduced herself as Michelle and told me she lived about 10 minutes down the trail. She had long gray hair and piercing blue eyes that made you feel like she could see right through you. She wasn't rude exactly, more like blunt. She welcomed me to the woods and handed me the basket, saying, "Always keep your lanterns full, your windows shut tight, and your wits sharper than your axe." It sounded more like a warning than advice. Despite the weird vibe, I appreciated her kindness. She seemed reclusive, but not unfriendly. That night, there was a thunderstorm, rare for Oregon, but it happens. I lit a few candles and curled up on the couch with a book, trying to ignore the flickering power. Some might find that kind of isolation scary, but I loved it. The natural sounds of the storm were soothing to me. A few hours after the storm started, there was a loud banging at the door. It was Michelle, soaked to the bone, clutching a flashlight. She blurted out that she had seen someone near my woodpile and that I should know about it. I was confused but concerned. I stepped out onto the porch, shining my flashlight into the rain, but I couldn't see anything. Before I could say anything else, she told me to be careful and walked away. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of a branch snapping outside my bedroom window. I crept to the window and saw Michelle standing at the edge of the woods, her body angled away from my house. I ducked before she could see me. When I looked again, she was gone. I didn't sleep for hours. The next morning, there was another knock at the door. This time, it wasn't Michelle. It was a burly, bald man with a thick beard. I froze in horror. I retreated to my bathroom, locked the door, and called the police. As I was on the phone, I heard banging.